Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 378. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I want to thank you all for being patient with me over the past few weeks, as I've had a lot of family stuff going on, as well as buying a house. So this is the first show I'm recording in our new house, which is, exciting that I got enough of my stuff here to finally do a show here. And hopefully that means the schedule of the show will be consistent. Back to 3 shows a week coming out, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, later in the day, or at the very latest, Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning. So try and get back on the regular schedule. And with that, I'm just going to jump into the news today. Oh, I do want to thank everybody who went over to antiwar.com and donated for the last fundraiser. It was really successful. We did a great job, and we hit our goal pretty quickly. So for everybody who went out and contributed, really appreciate it. You're helping the most important site on the internet keep going. Now, I also want to mention we got the Libertarian Institute here, which is where the show is hosted and is another place where I work. I'm the news editor there. And as news editor, I write some articles for the news section of the site. And I wrote this one: Western officials believe Russia will gain the upper hand in Ukraine. American and European officials now assess that time is on Russia's side, according to the Wall Street Journal. Washington and its Western allies transferred billions in weapons to Kiev under the mistaken belief it would force Russian President Vladimir Putin to negotiate. Officials in some capitals now fear the Kremlin could gain the upper hand in a lengthy war of attrition, the outlet reported on Sunday, adding that there is a worry in some Western capitals that time might be on Russia's side. The journal spoke with Western officials who believe the massive military aid packages that members of the NATO alliance have provided to Kiev would break the Kremlin's resolve. However, Moscow has weathered the Western economic sanctions and the fall offensive by Ukrainian forces. Moreover, Russian soldiers are now on the offensive. In response to the bleak assessment of the Western war effort, many officials are advocating for an increase in arms transfers for more advanced weapons. Lithuanian Foreign Minister argued that continuing the military aid to Kiev ensures more Russians will die on the Ukrainian battlefield. The longer we give them, the more people they can throw at the Ukrainians. So the journal also notes that some Western leaders are skeptical about sending more aid to Ukraine because it could escalate the war into a wider conflict between NATO and Russia. Others who voiced opposition to more aid argued it was unlikely to change the outcome of the war. Putin has expressed for decades that Ukraine is a core security concern of Russia and that NATO support for Kiev crossed Moscow's red line. In 2008, then State Department official, now CIA Director William Burns, wrote a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stating that Ukrainian entry into NATO was the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. Even with Burns in his cabinet, Joe Biden made Ukraine a de facto NATO member of the alliance by September 2021, according to foreign policy analyst Ted Galen Carpenter. Putin began his military buildup that preempted the Russian invasion of Ukraine just weeks after, signing some agreements and carrying out war games in Ukraine. So I think this is interesting because it's a very true admission from Western officials that, look, essentially what we're doing here is we poured all these weapons into Ukraine, and we thought that doing that, eventually Russia would decide to negotiate. Now, look, I'm sure there's a lot of people within the foreign policy elite who didn't necessarily believe that, but I think that was probably the overriding argument in the White House that was winning people in favor of sending more weapons. Now they've reached the realization that this isn't going to make the difference, which is crazy because we'll talk about, the tanks that were the main battle tanks that we're sending to Ukraine, which is a major escalation, but also some new longer range rockets and missiles that we're preparing to send to the country. So this is really interesting how you have all this going on at the same time, where you have these admissions from officials that, this policy isn't working. And yet the only prescription they could ever come up with was then we need to escalate more, even if, Russia is always bound to gain the upper hand. Now, let's see. This is yeah, so there wasn't, the Germans are obviously more skeptical. The Eastern Europeans are more hawkish as they had been throughout the war. The Brits and the Americans are also in the extremely hawkish camp of the NATO alliance. But this is what, we've been talking about on this show since the beginning of the war, that Russia is going to gain the upper hand here. They are going to uh, get at least a big chunk of, not a big chunk as in, half of the country, but, as in the Donbass, the region, probably the southern regions there too. Um, and there's not anything that, short of waging a nuclear war with Russia and basically fighting this thing into a nuclear Armageddon kind of stalemate. There's nothing that the U.S. could do that will prevent Russia from eventually gaining the upper hand and taking what they want in Ukraine. It's just too close to Ukraine's sphere of influence. Now, I've been very surprised at how much the U.S. has been willing to pour into Ukraine. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that the West has contributed to this war effort. Talking about sending weapons to Ukraine in such massive amounts. We're talking about the Ukrainian military now paralleling the yearly spending of the Russian military. Initially Biden said we're not going to send tanks. Now we're sending tanks. Now we're sending long range missiles. All these things that we said we weren't going to do, we've done. And so, maybe it should have been easier to predict. I should have said, oh, there's really going to be this massive mobilization in the West and we're going to send tanks to Ukraine. But it just really didn't seem like something that was going to happen at the time. So you would have imagined that Russia would have, taken their advantage and taken what they wanted by now. But as the Lithuanians are saying, basically what the West is doing is, they're slowly turning up the temperature. So Russia continues to have to commit more and more assets to Ukraine. Of course, this means Ukrainians are also dying in probably greater numbers than the Russians, since this war is being fought on their territory. And how disturbing that is. Now, Zelensky is very much bought into it. He's addicted to this Western drug. They start him off on little hits and now they got him out to battle tanks. And so, he's just going to keep wanting more and more of these Western weapons, and he'll continue to throw his people into the meat grinder here and not in any way adopt any kind of position that could help end this war in a diplomatic way. So this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on January 29th. Zelensky says Ukraine needs more weapons faster. Ukrainian President Zelensky Sunday said Ukraine needs to secure the supply of new weapons from its Western backers and that the arms deliveries need to speed up. It's very important to maintain the dynamics of defense support from our partners. The speed of supply has been and will be one of the key factors in this war. And so, we've seen time and time again where the West only gives Ukraine essentially as much weapons as they need, so their military doesn't fall apart every time. They're more on their back foot, they're really struggling. That's when the West will agree to send like a new tranche of weapons, a new upgrade. So recently Russia's been making some gains. Now suddenly they're interested in sending tanks and longer range missiles, where when Ukraine was making gains, then they weren't so much into that. And it's interesting how we get this, where again they're trying to keep Ukraine from collapsing. They want to make sure that the army is able to fight enough to keep Russia fighting, but at the same time they're not interested. And I think this is good because again Russia would just continue to escalate as well. But it's not that they're sending these weapons right away. They're waiting until Ukraine is in desperate need of them and about to really suffer here. Maybe every time Zelensky's like, well, I maybe I should go back to the table, they'll say, hey, you want another $1 billion in weapons? And he says, well, we should keep fighting. So the Ukrainian leader said that the Russians seek to exhaust Ukrainian forces, and for that reason, Kiev must speed up the event, speed up the supply and opening of a new necessary weaponry options for Ukraine. So I'm sure in some sense, Zelensky is aware of these assessments from Western leaders that time is on Russia's side. And so, he's saying if we're going to win this war, we need to just, do it now, because eventually Russia will gain the upper hand, but he doesn't realize his backers don't necessarily want that. They want Russia to be exhausted. So Russia is weak in the long term. This is why I'm anti-war, why no country should go to war, and why it was bad for Russia to go to war. Doing so put them in a position where, in the long run, it's going to hurt the Russian society and the Russian economy. So, the same day that Biden made the announcement last week that the U.S. would be providing Ukraine with M1 Abrams tanks, Zelensky was demanding more. An advisor to Zelensky said Saturday that Ukraine is in fast track with its Western backers on the possibility of receiving fighter jets and longer range missiles. So let's go ahead and talk about, let's mention this real quick. Let's talk about the tanks before we talk about the longer range missiles. This from Date to Camp on January 31st. Ukraine says it will receive 120 to 140 Western tanks in first wave of deliveries. Ukrainian Foreign Minister said Tuesday that Ukraine expects to receive between 120 and 140 Western-made tanks in the first wave of deliveries. The tank coalition now has 12 members. I can note that in the first wave of contributions, the Ukrainian armed forces will receive between 120 and 140 Western-made tank models. These are Leopard 2, Challenger 2, and M1 Abrams. Now, coming may be a loose term because it's not clear if it's going to be 6 months, 8 months, a year before these M1 Abrams are even to the point where they could be effectively used by the Ukrainians on the battlefield. I think logistically and then performance wise on a battlefield like Ukraine, the Leopard 2 tanks are the ones that Ukraine and the West is most interested to get to Ukraine. I'm not sure to what extent and how long it's going to take to train the Ukrainian forces on those tanks and when those could actually get to the battlefield. But they're talking now about waves, so I'm guessing they're looking 2 or 3 years down the line where maybe it'll be this September, October that we're having a new pledge of sending Abrams tanks to Ukraine. But, then we're looking at another 6 months or so before those are reaching the battlefield. So, these are the second wave may not even be coming until next spring or something like that, as the timeline for some of these deliveries has been kind of slow, especially as there's, I think, kind of a backlog in demand for Abrams tanks at this point. Now, this article, one second here. This is possibly one of the most significant escalations that we have seen, I think, in the Western military support for the Ukrainian war since the Biden administration initially agreed to send the HIMARS rocket systems. U.S. prepares to send Ukraine larger range rockets in NET's arms package, and this from Dave DeCamp. The U.S. is preparing another major escalation to military aid to Ukraine, as Reuters reports the NET's arms package will include rockets that have a range of 94 miles, almost double the range of munitions Ukraine was provided for the HIMARS rocket system. Citing 2 unnamed U.S. officials, Reuters said that the U.S. will provide Ukraine with a longer-range Boeing-made ground-launched small-diameter bombs for the first part of a over $2 billion arms package that could be announced as soon as this week. The official said that the GLSDB, those little bombs, I think they're 500 or 250 pound bombs, will be provided under the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, which allows the Pentagon to purchase arms for Ukraine. Weapons provided under USAI could take months or years to deliver, as they involve contracts that might need to be manufactured. And I do believe that these are munitions that are being specifically developed for Ukraine. A few months ago, the Pentagon put out a call saying, hey, weapons makers, let us know what you got, what we could use on the Ukrainian battlefield. And so Boeing came out with this plan where they were going to attach rocket motors to small diameter bombs, and then they would be able to launch those bombs several miles before using JDAM kits on those bombs to guide them to their targets. Now, recently, the Pentagon said this is going to be redundant. And so we've been talking on the show how it seems that this means the Pentagon is aware that in the future we will be sending some kind of fighter jets to Ukraine, because you don't need to put the rocket motors on the small diameter bombs if you just attach them to the planes and use the JDAM kits to deliver them that way. So that's kind of been, you know, my take on this show and why I think we're going to be providing fighter jets to Ukraine soon. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to send these rocket systems, and it appears we are now. The Pentagon has said throughout the war, you know, the tanks are going to be too complicated to maintain and use for the Ukrainian forces. The Patriot missile systems are going to be too complicated to maintain and use for the Ukrainian forces. It's too hard to train them on this system or that system. And they keep saying, oh, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this. And the Pentagon brings up logistical reasons why they don't want to do this. And yet, eventually political decisions are made in the White House, Pentagon decisions are overridden, and they move forward with more advanced military equipment. So I kind of assume that that's going to have, you know, that we should all assume that's going to happen. And I imagine it's going to be the case with the F-16s, the same case with these rockets and with the tanks, as we already saw. Now, with all this escalation, you would think, man, NATO must really think they're going to fight a war with Russia, and apparently that's the case. This from Dave DeCamp on January 29th. NATO official says alliance is ready for direct confrontation with Russia. Ambassador or Admiral Robert Bauer, the head of NATO's military committee, said that NATO is ready for direct confrontation with Russia, citing the alliance's recent efforts to boost its presence in Eastern Europe. Last year, NATO placed new battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia on top of the ones that have already been deployed in Poland and the Baltic Seas for years. The U.S. also deployed troops on its own, sending tens of thousands of more troops to Europe, including many that are stationed near the Ukrainian border with in Poland and Romania. Bauer, a Dutch naval officer, also said NATO countries should discuss shifting to a war economy where civilian factories started producing military goods similar to what the United States did during World War II. We had to increase defense industry production, and there are already more talks on the subject at the national level, Bauer said in an interview with Portuguese TV. This could mean prioritizing certain raw materials, certain production capabilities needed for the defense industry rather than the civilian one. Those priorities should be discussed about partly, and a war economy in peacetime. And this is really concerning. You know, these people are really getting ready for war. They know, or they believe at least, that it's not going to be themselves and them families doing the fighting and dying. And so these are just like fun war games for them to play, when in reality, you know, they're playing with the possibility of end of all life on the planet. So let's talk about the F-16s, because I do still think those are going to Ukraine. This on January 30th, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Poland says it's ready to send F-16s to Ukraine in coordination with NATO. Polish officials said Monday that Warsaw is willing to send Ukraine U.S.-made F-15 fighter jets, but only in coordination with NATO. We want to act in full coordination here, the Polish Prime Minister said, since the U.S. and Germany announced last week that the Ukraine would be receiving Abrams and Leopard tanks. Ukrainian officials are now demanding Western-made fighter jets as the next escalation of military aid. When asked on Monday if the U.S. would be sending F-16s to Ukraine, President Joe Biden simply replied no, but U.S. officials previously said they wouldn't provide Kiev with M1 Abrams tanks and other equipment that Washington ultimately sent. Ukrainian officials appear confident that they will receive the F-16s or some other kind of fighter jets. A Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson said that work was being done to prepare Ukrainian airfields for advanced weapon Western-made fighter jets. In order to send F-16s, Poland needs the approval of U.S. under export rules. The Netherlands has also signaled that it might be willing to send F-16s, which the Dutch foreign minister saying his country would have an open mind if asked about the transfer. Now, I think that the F-16s and particularly those new missiles with the small diameter bombs are going to be problematic in the escalatory cycle here, because they give Ukraine longer range, and we've heard from the Russians several times. And I think we've seen this reflected on the battlefield, that when the U.S. gives Ukraine weapons, particularly weapons with longer range, Russia responds by saying, now we have to take more Ukrainian territory. In a rare, seemingly bout of sanity from the Rand Corporation, a new report says a long war in Ukraine is against U.S. interests. The Rand Corporation issued a new report that warns against a protracted conflict in Ukraine and says a prolonged war is against U.S. interests, breaking from the view of many hawks in Washington that the U.S. should support the fight against Russia for the long term. Rand is funded directly by the U.S. military and often shapes U.S. policies, including hawkish ones towards Moscow. A 2019 report titled Extending Russia examined the risks and benefits of the ways the U.S. could try to extend Russia, and many of those policies have been implemented, including the provision of lethal aid to Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, and hindering the country's gas and oil exports. And this was, done before the war in Ukraine, after the 2019 report, though. The new report from Rand, titled Avoiding a Long War, examines the risks of the current conflict and acknowledges a protracted conflict heightens the risk of nuclear war. A summary of the report reads, discussions of the Russia-Ukraine war in Washington is increasingly dominated by the question of how might it end. To inform this discussion, this perspective identifies ways in which the war could evolve and how alternative trajectories would affect U.S. interests. The authors argue that in addition to minimizing the risk of major escalations, the U.S. interest would be best preserved by avoiding a protracted conflict. The authors say that the war in Ukraine is harder for the U.S. to focus its efforts to prepare for a future conflict with China. And of course, this is always, the statement from particularly the right-wing hawks in conflict, which is in Congress, which is, this war in Ukraine is terrible. We're supporting a government that does bad things. They're corrupt. Where are weapons going? All these great questions, all these great concerns about escalating the conflict with Russia. And then they say, because if we continue to focus on Ukraine, we won't be able to support Taiwan in our war against China. And then, that's an equally stupid and terrible war to get us into, and maybe even worse. The report says that the major risk of a long war in Ukraine is that there would be a prolonged elevated risk of Russia to use nuclear of Russia nuclear use and a NATO-Russia war. It says avoiding these two forms of escalation is a paramount U.S. priority. When it comes to Ukraine retaking more territory that Russia captured, the report says this is only a less significant benefit, and that avoiding a long war is a higher priority for the United States than facilitating significantly more Ukrainian territorial control. It places weakening Russia as a greater benefit to the U.S. than Ukrainian gains, but still not worth the risk of a long war. And, this is another just telling omission in this article that so many in Washington, even the people who are now a little bit skeptical about the war, really admit that the main benefit they drive from this war is to weaken Russia. So, and it just a tiny bit of good news here. Maybe not. The Egyptian foreign minister says Russia passes message from Lavrov to Blinken. Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov said on Tuesday that his Egyptian counterpart delivered a message from Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling on Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. Lavrov met with the Egyptian foreign minister in Moscow and told reporters that he conveyed the message from Blinken, and who was in Cairo on Monday. Russia is ready to listen to any serious proposal that is aimed at resolving the current situation and its comprehensive contents, but that the U.S. isn't interested in proposing that. And to be honest and fair here, Russia really isn't either. Although, I always like to yell at my own government a little bit more than others. Suspected U.S. drone strike kills 3 alleged Al-Qaeda members in Yemen. And this just quickly before I wrap up the show here, I want to mention that the war on terror is going on. I know we all forgot about it. And look, having some anxiety about nuclear war and the potential Russia-NATO conflict is a big deal and worth paying attention to. And if the war on terror falls off your radar sometimes, that's not the worst thing to happen. Because it's hard to look at war all day, but good to remember occasionally that Joe Biden has not held up his pledge to end the war in Yemen, not the war in Yemen that the U.S. is supporting Saudi Arabia and the UAE against the Houthis, and not the U.S. drone war in Yemen waged against the forces that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are supporting in Yemen. So, of course, like most of these conflicts, we're on both sides of this war. At least this way, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, if they actually did kill AQAP members in Yemen, this is, an international terrorist group that's backed by the Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the U.S., effectively in the war that they're waging against the Houthis in the north of that country. However, who knows who they're actually killing and who they drop these bombs on. But, there are some bad terrorists there who I'm sure have been allowed to fester and collect some weapons and money in the chaos of the war against, again, the Houthis there. So that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in. Connor will be back for the next show this week, so we'll have a pretty good in-depth report on what's going on with the Iran situation. There's been some attacks in that country by Israel this week, so big show coming up later this week. Thanks.